By noon, the fete had acquired the peculiar quality of an event proceeding simultaneously on two levels. The surface manifestation of village gaiety, with its game stalls and prize draws, and beneath it, an undercurrent of knowing glances and whispered consultations that suggested the morning's disturbance had not gone unnoticed. Miss Marple had positioned herself near the tea urn with the apparent purpose of assisting Mrs. Winters, the vicar's wife, though her actual occupation involved absorbing the various fragments of conversation that drifted past like autumn leaves. It was Mrs. Winters herself who, after pouring what must have been her 100th cup of Darjeeling, leaned close to Miss Marple with the conspiratorial air of someone who had acquired information of significance. She mentioned, with the careful casualness of one who wished to appear guileless, that apparently there had been some sort of problem at the house this morning, something to do with the Colonel's study, though of course she didn't know the particulars. But Mrs. Hudson had seemed most distressed when carrying that dreadful wet raincoat through the corridor, and wasn't it peculiar that it should be wet when no rain had fallen? Miss Marple accepted this information with the serene appreciation one might show toward an interesting observation about the weather, while mentally cataloguing the detail with considerable interest. The raincoat, she reflected, raised several questions worth pondering. The morning had been dry, the threatening clouds notwithstanding, which suggested the garment had been wet from some source other than current meteorological conditions. It was, moreover, a man's raincoat, from what she could discern, and the question of whose raincoat it might be, and more intriguingly, why its discovery had prompted such visible concern in the Colonel, deserved some attention. As though summoned by the universe's peculiar sense of timing, Dr. Havering himself appeared at the edge of the marquee, speaking urgently with Colonel Blackwood, while Margaret Blackwood hovered nearby with the expression of someone witnessing developments they had not anticipated or appreciated. The Colonel looked, if Miss Marple's perception served her accurately, distinctly unwell. His complexion had acquired a greyish quality that suggested either shock or the preliminary stages of some digestive disturbance. Dr. Havering, a man in his early 60s with the bearing of someone accustomed to authority, was gesturing with the controlled precision of medical professionals everywhere, and though his words remained inaudible to the gathered villagers, his manner suggested he was delivering information rather than receiving it. Within moments, the Colonel had excused himself from the fete, and Dr. Havering had departed toward the house with the purposefulness of a man attending to a medical emergency. Miss Marple, observing these developments with the calm attention she might have applied to a particularly complex knitting pattern, noted that Constance Havering had watched her husband's departure with an expression suggesting she possessed considerably more knowledge than she had previously disclosed, and that Timothy Ashford, upon witnessing this exchange, had suddenly discovered an urgent necessity to examine the white elephant stall with an intensity that seemed entirely disproportionate to the chipped teapots and dog-eared paperback novels displayed there. By 1:30, rumors had begun to circulate with the efficiency of water seeping through permeable soil. The most prevalent theory suggested that Colonel Blackwood had suffered some sort of cardiac episode, though this seemed to contradict the observable fact that he remained, however reluctantly, among the living and still in residence at Thornfield House. A secondary theory proposed that there had been an accident, a fall perhaps, though again the identity of the injured party remained uncertain, and no ambulance had been summoned, which typically indicated either that matters were less serious than initially believed or considerably more serious than the village wished to contemplate. Miss Marple found herself conversing with the postmaster's wife, a woman named Dorothy Cleves, who possessed an almost supernatural ability to extract information from the most determined of confidants. Dorothy mentioned, in passing, that she had seen Marcus Blackwood, the Colonel's eldest son, who had been away at business in London, but had apparently returned to St. Mary Mead some weeks prior, arriving at the house early that morning in a rather agitated state, and that he had been seen entering the Colonel's study with considerable urgency. She further noted, with the conspiratorial lowering of her voice, that Marcus and his father had never quite recovered from certain disagreements regarding the management of the family's considerable business interests, and that tensions had been particularly pronounced since Marcus's return. The information was delivered with the practiced innocence of one who merely observed and reported, though Dorothy's eyes gleamed with the satisfaction of possessing knowledge of significance. Miss Marple thanked her kindly for this illuminating detail, and mentioned that it was remarkable how families sometimes experience the most trying misunderstandings, while privately noting that Margaret Blackwood's rigid posture and occasional glances toward her watch suggested mounting anxiety rather than mere concern for a household disruption. As the afternoon progressed toward 3 o'clock, the fete had begun its inevitable descent into the latter stages of such EV. Hence, where the energy of the morning had exhausted itself and only the most dedicated attendees remained, tidying stalls and calculating the day's financial success. It was at this juncture that Constance Havering approached Miss Marple near the flower display with the air of someone who had made a deliberate decision to breach the walls of careful discretion. She inquired, with studied casualness, whether Miss Marple had observed the Colonel's apparent distress, and whether Miss Marple, in her considerable experience of village life, might venture an educated guess regarding its source. The question was framed as innocent social conversation, yet the intensity with which Constance awaited the response suggested she had posed it with considerable deliberation. Miss Marple, setting aside a length of green floral wire with methodical care, replied that she had observed little beyond the ordinary anxieties that occasionally troubled conscientious people, though she acknowledged that morning had contained certain peculiarities worthy of quiet consideration. Constance, satisfied or disappointed by this non-committal response, it was difficult to determine which, wandered away, leaving Miss Marple to contemplate the raincoat, the study, the early morning visitor, and the particular quality of alarm that had manifested itself in so many directions simultaneously. The fete concluded at 5 o'clock, with the efficient dismantling that characterized such events, and Miss Marple, declining several offers of assistance, gathered her floral materials with deliberate slowness, allowing the village to disperse gradually around her. She had observed, as the afternoon progressed, certain behaviors that had accumulated in her mind like pieces of a puzzle not yet assembled into any coherent image, yet possessing shapes and configurations that suggested they might eventually form something of significance. Timothy Ashford, she had noted, had remained at the fete longer than his usual pattern would dictate, and he had contrived to speak briefly with young Gwyneth near the refreshment table, though their conversation had been interrupted almost immediately by Constance Havering, who seemed to harbor protective inclinations regarding her younger relative's romantic entanglements. More intriguingly, Marcus Blackwood had appeared at the house gates around 4 o'clock, ostensibly departing, yet his departure had been observed by Miss Marple with particular interest, because his expression bore the distinctive quality of someone who had received news of considerable disturbance. As Miss Marple made her way back to her cottage, her canvas bag containing secateurs and wire clips held securely against her hip, the afternoon had begun its transition into evening with that peculiar English quality of prolonged twilight. The street lamps had not yet been illuminated, though their time was approaching, and the village had taken on the quieter demeanor of a community settling into its evening rhythms. It was as she passed the Blackwood residence that she observed Colonel Blackwood himself in the drive, speaking with Dr. Havering in low but urgent tones. The colonel appeared considerably more composed than he had during the morning, though his bearing retained that rigidity suggesting suppressed anxiety, and his gestures, typically controlled and measured, had acquired a somewhat jerky quality. Dr. Havering, for his part, maintained the professional composure of a physician delivering information of medical import, though Miss Marple, whose observational faculties extended to the interpretation of physical tension, detected in his frame an undercurrent of concern that transcended ordinary medical consultation. The doctor's hand rested briefly on the colonel's shoulder in what might have been intended as reassurance, yet the gesture carried an undertone of something more complicated. Sympathy, perhaps, or the unspoken acknowledgement of difficult circumstances. Miss Marple continued her progress homeward at her customary measured pace, neither hastening nor lingering, the very picture of an elderly woman returning from village activities, yet her mind was engaged in the process of correlating observations and questioning implications. By the time she reached her cottage and had settled herself in her sitting room with her knitting, a task that allowed her hands occupation while her mind pursued more complex endeavors, the evening had darkened into that blue-gray hour when day surrenders to night. She was contemplating the matter of the wet raincoat with considerable interest when her telephone rang, causing her to set aside her needlework with the patient acceptance of one accustomed to life's interruptions. It was Mrs. Hudson, the Colonel's housekeeper, calling from the house with an urgency in her voice that suggested she had reached a point where discretion had become secondary to necessity. She inquired, with the careful phrasing of someone selecting words with precision, whether Miss Marple might be available for a private conversation, and whether she might perhaps call at the house on some pretext that would not appear extraordinary. Miss Marple, whose experience had taught her to recognize genuine distress beneath attempts at concealment, agreed without hesitation, and suggested that she might call the following morning ostensibly to inquire about certain plants for the parish garden, a pretext sufficiently ordinary to require no explanation or suspicion. Mrs. Hudson's relief was palpable even across the telephone wires, and she thanked Miss Marple with the gratitude of someone who had been carrying a burden alone and had suddenly discovered assistance available. After the call concluded, Miss Marple sat for some considerable time in the gathering darkness, her knitting abandoned on her lap, contemplating the peculiar progression of events that had begun with a wet raincoat and a housekeeper's distress, and had escalated through a series of observed behaviors and unguarded conversations into something that clearly demanded investigation beyond the ordinary scope of village gossip. She rose, switched on her reading lamp with deliberate care, and retrieved from her bookshelf a volume concerning the psychology of human behavior, a text she consulted periodically when human nature presented particularly complex configurations. The night descended fully as she read, and the village beyond her windows settled into silence, though Miss Marple knew from long experience that silence frequently concealed turbulent currents beneath. At 9:30, she heard the distinctive sound of an automobile arriving at Thornfield House, followed by voices raised in what appeared to be heated discussion, though the distance prevented her from discerning the specific words exchanged. She recognized one voice as belonging to Inspector Morton from the neighboring town police force, a capable man, though lacking in what Miss Marple considered the more refined observational capacities, which suggested that the morning's discovery had progressed beyond private family concern into the realm of official investigation. She did not, however, permit this development to accelerate her preparations for the following day's conversation with Mrs. Hudson. Experience had taught her that premature action frequently obscured rather than illuminated the truth, and that patience, while occasionally trying, remained the most reliable investigative tool available to those willing to employ it. She settled into her bed at her customary with the satisfaction of someone who sensed that the following day would bring developments of considerable significance, and that the apparently peaceful village of St. Mary Mead contained secrets that demanded careful, deliberate exposure. The morning arrived with that particular quality of clarity that sometimes follows nights of significant atmospheric disturbance, and Miss Marple rose at her customary hour of 6 o'clock, dressed with her habitual care, and prepared herself for the day's activities with the methodical attention she applied to all matters of consequence. She had slept soundly, a fact she attributed to the peaceful conscience of those who have decided upon a course of action and committed themselves to its execution, and she breakfasted on toast and marmalade while reviewing in her mind the various questions she intended to pose to Mrs. Hudson. The village, when she ventured out at 8:30, bore the curious demeanor of a community aware that significant events had transpired, but uncertain of their exact nature or implications. Several knots of people clustered at strategic locations, near the post office, outside the church, at the village green, engaged in the low-voiced conversations that characterized the dissemination of important intelligence. Miss Marple observed that the general theory had evolved somewhat overnight, and now centered on the proposition that some theft or financial irregularity had occurred at Thornfield House, a theory supported by the presence of Inspector Morton's vehicle, which remained parked in evident visibility. She noted also that the police presence had apparently galvanized certain individuals into action or concern, For Timothy Ashford, whom she encountered near the church, appeared considerably more anxious than he had the previous day, and his usual punctuality regarding his train departure seemed to have been abandoned entirely. She greeted him with her characteristic warmth, inquired solicitously after his health, and observed with interest that his response contained multiple verbal stumbles and an inability to meet her gaze directly, the classic indicators of someone harboring significant preoccupation or anxiety. By 9 o'clock, Miss Marple had made her way to Thornfield House, ostensibly carrying a small basket containing cuttings from her garden, a pretext sufficiently ordinary to require minimal explanation. She was admitted by Mrs. Hudson herself, who bore the appearance of someone who had experienced a night of considerable emotional turbulence. The housekeeper was a woman of perhaps 60, with the worn features of one who had devoted her life to the service of others, and her eyes held that particular quality of distress that suggested she was navigating events substantially beyond her comprehension or control. Mrs. Hudson guided Miss Marple not to the drawing-room, where visitors were customarily received, but rather to the small parlor adjoining the kitchens, a choice that underscored the confidential nature of the intended conversation. It was in this modest room, seated in chairs of considerable age, and surrounded by the domestic furnishings of working household spaces, that Mrs. Hudson began to speak, her words initially halting and uncertain, gradually acquiring the fluidity of relief that follows when burdens are finally shared. She explained that the previous morning, while attending to her customary duties, she had discovered something in the Colonel's study that had alarmed her sufficiently to bring it immediately to his attention. The raincoat that had caused such evident distress, she revealed, had been found partially concealed behind the curtains in the study window, and it was wet not from recent rain but from immersion in water, the sort of complete saturation that suggested deliberate submersion rather than accidental exposure. Moreover, the coat bore what appeared to be bloodstains, though whether they were of recent vintage or older origin remained unclear. The Colonel, upon discovering this item, had been thrown into considerable agitation and had immediately contacted Dr. Havering, who had apparently advised him of the necessity of involving the police. Miss Marple, absorbing this information with the calm demeanor of one accustomed to disturbing revelations, inquired as to the coat's ownership, a question that prompted Mrs. Hudson to pause and lower her voice to barely above a whisper. The coat, she revealed, appeared to belong to someone currently missing from the village, a man named Edward Ashford, Timothy's older brother, who had been away in London for several months but had returned to St. Mary Mead approximately 3 weeks prior under circumstances that had generated considerable village speculation and gossip. Edward Ashford, it seemed, had occupied a rather murky position in the community's estimation. He had been involved in various business ventures of questionable legitimacy, had separated from his wife under acrimonious circumstances, and had become entangled in financial dealings with certain individuals whose reputations extended beyond the ordinary bounds of respectability. Most significantly, he had apparently developed a concerning attachment to Margaret Blackwood, a fact that had apparently created considerable tension within the Blackwood household and had become the subject of substantial village commentary. Miss Marple's mental processes engaged themselves with renewed intensity upon receipt of this information, and she inquired whether Edward Ashford had been reported missing officially and whether the police investigation currently underway at Thornfield House concerned its elf with his disappearance or with some other matter entirely. Mrs. Hudson confirmed that Edward Ashford had not been reported missing through official channels, though his absence had been noted with concern by his mother and his brother Timothy. The police investigation, she understood, concerned itself with a matter of discovery at the house itself, something relating to the Colonel's study that had prompted the initial telephone call to Inspector Morton. Miss Marple rose from her chair and moved to the small window overlooking the kitchen garden, her expression thoughtful and composed, while her mind engaged in the complex process of correlating information, identifying gaps in knowledge, and formulating questions that would require careful, subtle exploration. She thanked Mrs. Hudson for her candor and confidence, assured her that discretion would be maintained, and suggested that the housekeeper continue about her ordinary duties, while Miss Marple herself undertook a few discreet inquiries in the village. As she prepared to depart, she paused at the door and asked one final question with apparent casualness, whether the Colonel or Mrs. Blackwood had mentioned what discovery in the study had prompted the initial alarm, or whether that particular detail remained shrouded in mystery. Mrs. Hudson confessed that she did not know precisely, though she suspected the raincoat itself constituted the primary discovery, and whatever else might have been found had remained undisclosed even to her. Miss Marple's departure from Thornfield House was accomplished with the same unhurried demeanor that characterized all her movements, though her mind was engaged in the rapid processing of information that Mrs. Hudson had provided. The revelation concerning Edward Ashford introduced a framework of considerable complexity into the morning's developments, and yet certain elements, Enid insufficiently explained to permit a coherent narrative to emerge. She walked through the village with apparent aimlessness, her basket of plant cuttings still in hand, allowing her feet to guide her toward the post office, where Dorothy Cleves was known to be stationed at this hour. Dorothy predictably observed Miss Marple's approach with the alacrity of someone prepared to exchange information, and she emerged from behind the postal counter with barely concealed eagerness. Within moments, they had settled themselves in the small area designated for postal consultations, and Dorothy had begun to elaborate upon her knowledge of Edward Ashford's return to St. Mary Mead with considerably more detail than she had previously provided. Edward, it appeared, had arrived with considerable fanfare approximately 6 weeks prior, driving an expensive motor car and announcing himself as a successful businessman engaged in import and export operations, a vague designation that had fooled few of those possessed of average cynicism regarding such claims. He had taken residence in a cottage on the outskirts of the village, a property owned by the vicar's brother, and had almost immediately begun to frequent the social circles that included the Blackwood household with a regularity that had prompted considerable village speculation regarding his intentions. Dorothy leaned closer, her voice acquiring the conspiratorial tone of one imparting information of particular significance, and revealed that Edward had been observed in extensive conversation with Margaret Blackwood on multiple occasions, most memorably at the church social gathering 3 weeks prior, where they had withdrawn to the garden ostensibly to discuss parish matters, but had remained absent for a duration suggesting topics of considerably more personal interest. This relationship, Dorothy intimated, had created what might charitably be described as considerable domestic tension within the Blackwood household, and the Colonel had been observed in several heated exchanges with his wife, the precise content of which remained unknown, but the intensity of which suggested matters of substantial consequence. Miss Marple listened to this elaboration with her characteristic patience, asking occasional questions with apparent innocent curiosity, and gradually extracted from Dorothy's extensive knowledge several additional details of significance. Edward Ashford's financial circumstances, while superficially impressive, had apparently begun to deteriorate within recent weeks, a fact evidenced by his sudden departure from various social engagements and his apparent withdrawal from the village's social circles. Timothy Ashford, his younger brother, had been observed in several anxious conversations with village acquaintances, conversations that terminated abruptly whenever other parties approached, suggesting Timothy possessed knowledge of matters he was reluctant to discuss openly. Most intriguingly, Colonel Blackwood had apparently been observed in conversation with Edward Ashford at the village inn approximately 10 days prior, and the exchange had been sufficiently contentious to be observed and commented upon by multiple witnesses. Following her departure from the post office, Miss Marple proceeded to the village library, where Constance Havering presided over the collection of literary works with the dedication of one who viewed librarianship as a form of intellectual stewardship. Constance, upon observing Miss Marple's entrance, emerged from her cataloguing work with evident interest, and they settled themselves in the library's reading room with the pretense of discussing certain literary matters. Miss Marple, engaging in what might be characterized as conversational misdirection, inquired whether Constance possessed any knowledge regarding Edward Ashford's business activities, commenting that she had heard certain rumors and wondered whether they possessed any foundation in fact. Constance's response was sufficiently guarded to suggest she possessed considerably more information than she was prepared to disclose, though her reluctance gradually yielded to Miss Marple's gentle inquiries, and she revealed that Edward Ashford had apparently attempted to involve her husband in various financial schemes of questionable legitimacy. Dr. Havering, possessing sufficient moral conviction to decline such opportunities, had consequently refused Edward's proposals with considerable directness, a refusal that had apparently generated some ill will between the two men. More significantly, Constance disclosed that Edward Ashford had apparently attempted to borrow substantial sums of money from Colonel Blackwood, ostensibly for business expansion, but actually, as Constance had gathered from certain overheard conversations, to cover gambling debts and losses incurred through failed financial ventures. Colonel Blackwood's refusal of these requests had apparently resulted in Edward threatening to expose certain information regarding the Blackwood family that would prove considerably damaging to their social standing and reputation. The precise nature of this threatened revelation remained unclear, though Constance suspected it involved Edward's ongoing relationship with Margaret Blackwood and the potential implications for the Colonel's marriage. By the time Miss Marple had concluded her visit to the library and had made her way toward her cottage, the afternoon had advanced considerably, and her mind had begun to assemble the fragmentary information into certain tentative configurations. Edward Ashford emerged from these various accounts as an individual of dubious character, possessed of financial desperation, romantic entanglements of questionable propriety, and the capacity for malicious threat when his desires were frustrated. Yet several critical questions remained unanswered. Where precisely was Edward Ashford at present? Had he truly disappeared, or was he deliberately absent from the village for some calculated reason? What was the significance of the wet raincoat discovered in the Colonel's study, and what events had necessitated its concealment? Most critically, what discovery had prompted the Colonel's evident alarm and the subsequent police investigation? Miss Marple's afternoon was interrupted by a telephone call from Inspector Morton himself, who inquired with professional courtesy whether she might be available for a brief conversation regarding certain village matters. She agreed with her customary graciousness, and within the hour the inspector had arrived at her cottage, a figure of somewhat ponderous competence, bearing the determined expression of one committed to the systematic investigation of suspicious circumstances. He inquired whether she had observed anything unusual in the village during recent weeks, a question Miss Marple answered with carefully calibrated honesty, providing sufficient information to demonstrate her observational capacities while withholding those details she had gathered through Mrs. Hudson's confidential revelations. By the time Inspector Morton departed, Miss Marple had acquired confirmation that Edward Ashford was indeed the subject of active investigation, though the specific charges remained undisclosed, and she had observed in the inspector's manner certain indications that suggested the matter possessed complications substantially beyond a simple disappearance. The evening of Inspector Morton's visit found Miss Marple engaged in her customary activities, the preparation of a modest supper, the completion of her knitting, and the perusal of certain correspondence. Yet her mind remained substantially occupied with the accumulation of information and the identification of those critical gaps that prevented coherent understanding of the morning's discoveries. She had settled into her sitting room with a cup of chamomile tea when the telephone rang once more, this occasion bringing the voice of Timothy Ashford, who requested with evident nervousness whether he might call upon her at his earliest convenience, a matter of some delicacy requiring discreet discussion. Miss Marple, sensing that this conversation might provide access to information currently restricted to the observations and reports of others, invited Timothy to visit immediately, and within 20 minutes he had presented himself at her door bearing the appearance of someone whose internal anxieties had manifested themselves in visible physical strain. She settled him in her sitting room with the practiced ease of one accustomed to receiving troubled visitors, provided him with tea, and permitted him several moments to compose himself before inquiring with gentle directness what matter had prompted his visit. Timothy's account emerged in halting, often circular fashion, frequently interrupted by expressions of doubt regarding whether he should be disclosing information that clearly involved family confidences. Yet gradually he revealed a narrative of considerable complexity and emotional consequence. Edward, his older brother, had indeed returned to St. Mary Mead under circumstances that Timothy characterized as desperate and financially precarious. The import and export business that Edward had publicized as his current occupation was, in reality, a largely fictional enterprise, and Edward's actual income derived from various ventures of questionable legality and dubious morale. Thank you. These activities had apparently involved financial fraud, the manipulation of credulous investors, and connections with individuals of genuinely criminal disposition. Edward's return to the village had been prompted by his need to escape certain creditors and associates whose patience with his accumulated debts had reached its terminus, and he had apparently conceived the notion that his family might be persuaded to provide the substantial financial assistance necessary to resolve his difficulties. Timothy had himself become the subject of Edward's solicitations, and his younger brother had been pressured, with increasing intensity, to provide access to the family's limited resources or to facilitate loans through Timothy's bank connections. These requests had been accompanied by veiled threats regarding what might occur should Timothy prove insufficiently cooperative, threats that had generated considerable anxiety and had prompted Timothy to seek employment and social outlets that would distance him from his brother's influence. The relationship between Edward and Margaret Blackwood, Timothy revealed with evident discomfort, had indeed progressed beyond the bounds of innocent friendship, though he stressed that he possessed no definitive knowledge of the relationship, physical manifestations. What he did know was that Margaret Blackwood, apparently dissatisfied with her marriage to the Colonel and attracted to Edward's superficial charm and apparent sophistication, had become emotionally entangled with him, and Edward, recognizing the potential utility of this connection, had deliberately cultivated the relationship with the calculated intention of gaining leverage with Colonel Blackwood. The Colonel, upon discovering the extent of this relationship and Edward's financial demands, had apparently engaged in several heated confrontations with both Edward and his wife, and these exchanges had apparently occurred with increasing frequency over the preceding 10 days. Most significantly, Timothy disclosed that approximately 3 days prior, Edward had threatened to expose evidence of Margaret Blackwood's affair unless the Colonel provided the financial assistance Edward demanded, a threat that had apparently precipitated a crisis of considerable magnitude within the Blackwood household. Timothy confessed that he had attempted to dissuade his brother from pursuing this course of action, had appealed to whatever ethical sensibilities Edward might possess, and had warned him of the potentially catastrophic consequences should he attempt such blackmail. Yet Edward, apparently convinced of his own invulnerability and desperate in his financial circumstances, had dismissed these warnings and had apparently proceeded with preparations to implement his threats. Timothy's final revelation concerned the specific nature of the discovery that had prompted the police investigation. According to information that had filtered through the household staff to Timothy's knowledge, it was not Edward Ashford himself who had been the focus of the morning's alarm, but rather evidence suggesting that Edward had met with some form of violent encounter. The raincoat discovered in the Colonel's study bore not only bloodstains but also evidence of having been struck or damaged with considerable force, and certain other details discovered in the study suggested that a physical altercation of significant severity had occurred within that room. Timothy's voice wavered considerably as he revealed his fear that his brother might be dead, and that the evidence suggested Colonel Blackwood might bear responsibility for whatever had transpired. Miss Marple listened to this extended revelation with her characteristic attentiveness, her expression remaining neutral and composed while her mind engaged in the rapid correlation of this information with the details she had previously accumulated. When Timothy had concluded his account and had exhausted his anxieties through articulation, Miss Marple inquired with apparent gentle curiosity several carefully formulated questions. She asked whether Timothy possessed knowledge of Edward's specific location during the preceding 48 hours, whether any communication had been received from Edward since the discovery of the raincoat, and whether Timothy possessed any information regarding the colonel's state of mind or his actions during the period when the altercation might have occurred. Timothy's responses were sufficiently detailed to suggest he had engaged in considerable investigation of his own, though his information remained fragmentary and inconclusive. Following Timothy's departure, Miss Marple remained seated in her darkened sitting room for some considerable time, her knitting abandoned, her attention focused on the careful assembly of a narrative that was beginning to acquire disturbing clarity. Yet certain elements remained insufficiently explained, and certain apparent connections seemed to possess inconsistencies that suggested the narrative might contain elements of misdirection or misconception. She rose finally and retrieved from her modest library a reference volume concerning the legal implications of various criminal acts, and she read with particular attention those sections addressing the distinctions between premeditated homicide, manslaughter, and justifiable self-defense, knowing that these distinctions might prove of considerable importance in understanding what had transpired at Thornfield House. The following morning arrived with the sort of clarity that sometimes emerges after extended periods of atmospheric uncertainty, and Miss Marple awoke with a sea of purpose that transcended her customary daily routines. She had spent the hours after Timothy's departure in contemplation rather than sleep, her mind assembling and reassembling the available information into various possible configurations, each possessing elements of logical consistency, yet each containing certain details that refuse to align with perfect coherence. She rose at her customary hour, dressed with particular care, and prepared herself for what she recognized would be a day requiring considerable delicacy and careful navigation of social conventions that typically governed village interactions. By 9 o'clock, she had made her way to the residence of Dr. Havering, ostensibly to inquire about certain medicinal herbs for her garden, though her actual intention involved acquiring information that only the doctor, with his professional obligations and access to the Blackwood household, might possess. Dr. Havering, a man of considerable intelligence and perceptiveness, received her in his study with the courtesy extended to an elder member of the community, though his expression suggested he recognized the pretextual nature of her visit. Miss Marple, employing her characteristic technique of apparent innocent curiosity, inquired whether the doctor had observed any health concerns among the Blackwood family that might merit his professional attention, commenting that she had noticed certain visible signs of stress that had prompted her concern. Dr. Havering's response was sufficiently guarded to demonstrate his understanding of professional confidentiality, yet his hesitation and the careful selection of his words revealed considerably more than his explicit statements conveyed. He acknowledged that he had indeed attended to certain matters at Thornfield House, though the specific details remained subject to the constraints of medical privilege. However, he permitted himself to comment that the situation confronting the colonel and his family possessed dimensions considerably more complex than public speculation had yet recognized, and that certain developments had emerged that would likely alter the village's understanding of recent events substantially. Miss Marple pressed gently, inquiring whether the matter involved Edward Ashford's apparent disappearance, and whether the police investigation currently underway concerned itself with determining the circumstances surrounding that disappearance. Dr. Havering, after a moment of evident internal struggle between professional obligation and the recognition of Miss Marple's unusual perceptiveness, disclosed that Edward Ashford was indeed deceased, and that the circumstances surrounding his death had prompted the police investigation. The body had been discovered, he revealed with evident reluctance, in the quarry beyond the eastern edge of the village, partially concealed beneath debris and water, in a condition suggesting it had been submerged for several days. The raincoat discovered in the colonel's study appeared to have been Edward's, and the bloodstains upon it indicated a violent altercation had occurred, though the precise location and nature of that altercation remained subjects of ongoing investigation. Miss Marple received this confirmation with the composed demeanor of one whose suspicions had been substantially vindicated, and she inquired further whether the police possessed any definitive evidence regarding the identity of the party responsible for Edward's death, or whether the investigation remained in its preliminary stages, with multiple suspects remaining under consideration. Dr. Havering acknowledged that Inspector Morton had conducted interviews with various individuals at Thornfield House and elsewhere in the village, and that the investigation appeared to be progressing towards certain conclusions, though the definitive determination of guilt remained pending the completion of various investigative procedures. The doctor's manner suggested, however, that certain evidence had emerged that pointed with considerable specificity toward particular individuals, though he declined to elaborate upon the precise nature of that evidence or its implications. Following her departure from Dr. Havering's residence, Miss Marple directed her steps toward the village green, where she encountered Constance Havering engaged in conversation with several other women of her social circle. Miss Marple waited until Constance had concluded her discussion and had separated herself from the group, and she then invited Constance to accompany her on a brief walk, a proposal that Constance accepted with evident recognition that something of significance was being communicated through this informal invitation. As they walked along the pathway leading toward the church, Miss Marple inquired, with apparent casual interest, whether Constance had observed any recent developments in the investigation that Constance herself might find noteworthy or troubling. Constance's response revealed that she possessed considerably more detailed knowledge than she had previously disclosed, and she acknowledged, with evident reluctance, that the police investigation had apparently begun to focus upon Colonel Blackwood as the primary suspect in Edward Ashford's death. The evidence, as Constance understood it, included the discovery of Edward's raincoat in the Colonel's study, witnesses who had observed the Colonel and Edward in heated confrontation during the days preceding Edward's disappearance, and certain physical evidence discovered at the scene that suggested the Colonel possessed knowledge of how Edward's body had been disposed of in the quarry. Most damaging, apparently, was the revelation that Colonel Blackwood had taken a substantial withdrawal from his bank account on the day of Edward's disappearance, a transaction that the police interpreted as preparation for flight or the engagement of legal representation. Miss Marple listened to this elaboration with evident interest, and she inquired whether Constance possessed any understanding of Margaret Blackwood's response to these developments, and whether Mrs. Blackwood had communicated anything regarding her husband's possible involvement in the death. Constance's expression acquired a complexity that suggested considerable internal conflict regarding what information she possessed and whether she should disclose it, yet she ultimately revealed that Margaret Blackwood had submitted to police questioning and had provided testimony suggesting she believed her husband capable of violent action under circumstances of sufficient provocation, though she had declined to provide specific details regarding what provocation might have precipitated violence toward Edward Ashford. This testimony, Constance indicated, had apparently been sufficiently damaging to the Colonel's position that Inspector Morton had begun to move toward an arrest, pending only the completion of certain forensic examinations and witness interviews. As Miss Marple and Constance concluded their walk and prepared to separate, Miss Marple posed one final question with apparent innocence, whether Constance possessed any knowledge regarding the specific location where Edward's body had been discovered in the quarry, and whether the police had disclosed any details regarding the precise position in which the body had been found. Constance's response was sufficiently hesitant to suggest this particular detail had acquired significance in her own mind, and she acknowledged that the body had been discovered at a considerable distance from the quarry's primary access points, positioned in water and beneath debris in a manner suggesting deliberate concealment rather than accidental placement. The afternoon of Miss Marple's conversation with Constance brought developments that accelerated the pace of the investigation with remarkable swiftness, and by 3 o'clock the village had become aware through the effigy, NT dissemination network of Mrs. Hudson, and the various household staff that Colonel Blackwood had been formally arrested on suspicion of murder and conveyed to the police station in the neighboring town for more extensive questioning. The news spread through St. Mary Mead with the velocity characteristic of information of such magnitude, and clusters of villagers gathered at strategic locations to discuss the implications and to speculate regarding the precise circumstances that had led to such a dramatic development. Miss Marple observed these various gatherings with her characteristic attentiveness, noting the specific reactions of different individuals and cataloging the particular quality of their responses with the precision of one engaged in comparative human psychology. Timothy Ashford's response was conspicuously marked by visible relief, mingled with a troubled quality suggesting complex emotions regarding his brother's death and his father's apparent culpability. Marcus Blackwood, the Colonel's eldest son, appeared at Thornfield House during the late afternoon with an expression of grim determination, and he engaged in an extended conversation with his mother that could be observed through the drawing-room windows despite the distance. A conversation that appeared to involve considerable emotional intensity and the occasional sharp gesture suggestive of disagreement or accusation. It was this observation that prompted Miss Marple to take an action somewhat more direct than her customary investigative methodology, and she composed a brief note requesting an urgent private meeting with Marcus Blackwood at her cottage, a note she entrusted to young Gwyneth to deliver with instructions that it be presented as a matter of some delicacy. Within the hour, Marcus had presented himself at Miss Marple's door, bearing the appearance of a man constrained by courtesy boo. Tea possessed of considerably more urgent matters demanding his attention. Miss Marple received him in her sitting room with her characteristic warmth, offered him refreshment which he declined with evident impatience, and then proceeded to engage him in conversation with a directness that transcended her customary oblique approach. She began by acknowledging his obvious distress regarding the situation confronting his family, and she expressed her sympathy for the difficulties that must inevitably accompany such circumstances. Then, with careful deliberation, she posed a series of questions that appeared on their surface to concern themselves with Marcus's movements during the days preceding Edward Ashford's disappearance, his knowledge of his father's relationship with Edward, and his assessment of his parents' marital circumstances. Marcus's responses were initially guarded and defensive, yet as the conversation progressed, he gradually permitted himself to speak with considerable candor, apparently recognizing in Miss Marple a person whose perceptiveness transcended ordinary village gossip and whose interest proceeded from genuine desire to understand rather than from prurient curiosity. Marcus revealed that he had been aware of his mother's emotional entanglement with Edward Ashford, and that he had recognized the threat this posed not merely to his parents' marriage, but to the family's business interests and social standing. He disclosed further that he had attempted to warn his father of the seriousness of the situation, and that he had engaged in his own investigation into Edward Ashford's background discoveries, which had revealed Edward's involvement in various fraudulent schemes and his association with individuals of genuinely criminal character. Most significantly, Marcus revealed that he had confronted Edward personally approximately 1 week prior to Ward's disappearance, and had attempted to persuade Edward to leave the village and cease his involvement with Margaret Blackwood, a confrontation that had apparently resulted in Edward threatening to accelerate his blackmail campaign and to accelerate his efforts to extract financial assistance from the Colonel. Marcus acknowledged that he had reported the details of this confrontation to his father, and that he suspected this information had prompted the Colonel to take whatever action had resulted in Edward's death. Yet as Marcus continued to speak, certain inconsistencies began to emerge in his narrative, and Miss Marple observed with particular attention certain physical reactions that accompanied his recounting of specific events. When he described his movements on the day of Edward's disappearance, his manner acquired a quality of excessive precision, as though he were reciting a prepared account rather than recalling actual events. When he discussed his whereabouts during the evening hours when Edward must have encountered whoever had resulted in his death, his voice acquired a slightly higher pitch, and his hands engaged in more frequent gestures than they had throughout the remainder of the conversation. Miss Marple listened to these behavioral indicators with the attention a musician might devote to discordant notes in an otherwise harmonious composition, and she permitted the conversation to continue for some additional time before posing what appeared to be a casual inquiry regarding Marcus's employment in London and the specific nature of the business activities that had occupied his time during his extended absence from the village. Marcus's response to this inquiry revealed, with considerable clarity to anyone possessed of Miss Marple's perceptiveness, that his knowledge of his stated occupation was considerably less detailed than one might expect from someone actually engaged in such work, and that his explanation of his recent return to the village contained certain vagueness regarding the specific circumstances that had prompted his departure from London employment. Following Marcus's departure, Miss Marple remained contemplative for a substantial period, her mind engaged in the careful reassessment of her accumulated information in light of this new interview. Certain details began to acquire different significance when considered from an altered perspective, and certain apparent inconsistencies in the narrative concerning Edward Ashford's death began to suggest that the situation confronting the village possessed considerably more complexity than the police investigation had yet recognized. She rose, finally, and retrieved from her desk her correspondence with various individuals, and she examined with particular attention a letter she had received weeks prior from a London solicitor concerning certain matters that had seemed peripheral to the immediate concerns of the village, but which now acquired possible relevance. She then composed several careful inquiries addressed to contacts in London and beyond, inquiries designed to verify certain details regarding Marcus Blackwood's stated occupation and his actual movements during specific periods of recent time. As evening descended upon the village, Miss Marple settled herself with her knitting, yet her mind remained substantially engaged with questions that demanded resolution before certainty could be achieved regarding the true circumstances surrounding Edward Ashford's death and the genuine identity of the party responsible for that death. The following day brought responses to Miss Marple's inquiries with a speed that suggested the recipients had possessed substantial motivation to provide rapid assistance, and by mid-morning she had accumulated information that substantially altered her understanding of the situation confronting the village and the police investigation currently underway. A solicitor in London confirmed that Marcus Blackwood had been involved in financial dealings of questionable propriety, deals that had apparently involved the misappropriation of client funds and the perpetration of investment fraud on a scale considerably more substantial than Edward Ashford's smaller schemes. Furthermore, Marcus's departure from London had been precipitated by imminent discovery of these fraudulent activities, and he had apparently fled the city mere days before formal charges would have been filed against him. His return to the village appeared to have been motivated not by genuine business interests but by desperation regarding his financial circumstances and the necessity of acquiring substantial sums to satisfy creditors and to arrange for passage to jurisdictions possessing limited extradition agreements with England. Armed with this knowledge, Miss Marple recognized that certain details previously accepted as incidental acquired considerable significance, and she began to construct a narrative substantially different from the one that Inspector Morton appeared to be pursuing. The raincoat discovered in the Colonel's study, the blood evidence, the confrontation between the Colonel and Edward Ashford, and the Colonel's suspicious financial activities all possessed alternative explanations when viewed within the context of Marcus Blackwood's desperate financial circumstances and his possession of specialized knowledge regarding physical coercion derived from his criminal associations in London. By early afternoon, Miss Marple had determined that further investigation required direct action, and she composed a carefully worded letter addressed to Inspector Morton requesting an urgent meeting regarding certain matters he had discovered that she believed possessed considerable relevance to the investigation. Inspector Morton, who had developed a healthy respect for Miss Marple's perceptiveness during their previous interactions, responded with gratifying promptness, and he arrived at her cottage by mid-afternoon, bearing the slightly worn expression of a man engaged in an investigation that had begun to acquire unexpected complications. Miss Marple received the inspector in her sitting room and proceeded, with careful precision, to elaborate upon the information she had acquired regarding Marcus Blackwood's background and his desperate financial circumstances. She noted that the police investigation appeared to have proceeded from the assumption that Colonel Blackwood possessed sufficient motive and opportunity to murder Edward Ashford based upon Edward's relationship with Margaret Blackwood and his blackmail threats. However, she ventured to suggest that this narrative failed to account for several critical details that acquired different significance when alternative suspects were considered. She elaborated upon the inconsistencies in Marcus Blackwood's account of his whereabouts during the relevant time period, his employment history, and his financial circumstances, and she suggested that Marcus possessed both motive and opportunity to murder Edward Ashford for reasons entirely unrelated to the Colonel's marital difficulties. Edward, she proposed, might have possessed knowledge regarding Marcus's fraudulent activities in London, knowledge that Edward could have threatened to disclose in exchange for financial assistance, thus placing Marcus in a position where his desperation regarding his own legal and financial circumstances coincided with Edward's blackmail threats. Furthermore, she suggested that Marcus possessed the physical capability and the criminal associations to dispose of Edward's body in the quarry in a manner requiring considerably more sophistication than Colonel Blackwood could reasonably be expected to employ, and that the discovery of Edward S. Raincoat in the Colonel's study might be explained not by the Colonel's guilt, but by Marcus' deliberate placement of evidence designed to direct police suspicion toward his father. Inspector Morton listened to this elaboration with the gradually shifting expression of a man beginning to recognize that his investigation had proceeded along a false trajectory, and he acknowledged that Miss Marple's suggestions possessed sufficient plausibility to warrant immediate investigation. He departed Miss Marple's cottage with considerably more urgency than he had arrived, and Miss Marple observed his departure with the satisfaction of one whose analytical processes had been vindicated, though she recognized that her suggestions remained theories requiring confirmation through proper investigative procedures. Within hours, the village became aware that Inspector Morton had returned to Thornfield House and had conducted extensive interviews with Marcus Blackwood regarding his whereabouts during the relevant time period and regarding his financial circumstances. The interviews apparently proceeded with increasing intensity, and by evening, additional police officers had arrived from the neighboring town bearing equipment and documentation, suggesting that more intensive investigation and potential arrest were in imminent prospect. Miss Marple observed these developments from her cottage with her characteristic composure, though she recognized that the situation had acquired a quality of danger that transcended ordinary village intrigue. For Marcus Blackwood, if indeed guilty, possessed considerably more to lose than ordinary village transgressions typically entailed. That evening brought an unexpected visitor to her door in the form of Margaret Blackwood herself, appearing at twilight in a state of considerable emotional turbulence, and bearing the appearance of a woman whose carefully maintained social composure had begun to fracture under excessive strain. Miss Marple admitted her guest with her customary courtesy, and perceived almost immediately that Margaret possessed information she felt compelled to disclose, information that apparently conflicted with her earlier testimony to police and that apparently involved matters she had previously withheld from investigation. Margaret revealed, with evident difficulty, that she had observed something on the evening of Edward's disappearance that had initially seemed insignificant, but which had acquired considerable meaning in light of subsequent developments. She had observed Marcus Blackwood departing the house carrying what appeared to be a substantial package wrapped in canvas, and she had observed him driving his motor vehicle in the direction of the quarry at an hour when such journeys seemed unusual and purposeless. At the time, she had attributed little significance to this observation, attributing it instead to Marcus's various business activities and personal errands. However, she now recognized that this observation possessed potential relevance to the police investigation, and she had determined that her obligation to truth and justice transcended her family loyalty and the complicated emotions she harbored regarding her husband's current circumstances. Miss Marple listened to Margaret's disclosure with grave attention, and she recognized that this testimony, combined with the information she had provided to Inspector Morton and the investigative procedures presumably underway, had substantially altered the trajectory of the case toward a resolution substantially different from the one that had appeared probable mere hours earlier. The arrest of Marcus Blackwood proceeded with the formal precision that characterized such police procedures, and by the following morning the village had been informed, through its customary information networks, that Marcus had been taken into custody pending formal charges regarding the murder of Edward Ashford. The news generated a peculiar quality of shock that transcended the earlier surprise regarding Colonel Blackwood's arrest, for Marcus represented the respectable face of the Blackwood family, The son engaged in legitimate business activities in London. The individual whose return to the village had seemed merely an ordinary, domestic occurrence, rather than the prelude to tragedy and revelation. Miss Marple observed the village's reaction with her characteristic attentiveness, noting how quickly suspicions and gossip shifted their focus from the colonel to his son, and how the various narratives that had circulated regarding Edward Ashford's disappearance now required substantial revision and reinterpretation. Inspector Morton paid a formal visit to Miss Marple's cottage the following afternoon, bearing with him an expression of professional appreciation mingled with a certain chagrin that suggested his investigation might have concluded more expeditiously had he possessed her perceptiveness from the outset. He confirmed that Marcus Blackwood had indeed perpetrated the murder of Edward Ashford, under circumstances substantially aligned with Miss Marple's theoretical reconstruction, and he proceeded to elaborate upon the details that the more intensive investigation had revealed. Edward Ashford, apparently, had discovered evidence regarding Marcus's fraudulent activities in London through his own unsavory connections with criminal elements in that city, and Edward had approached Marcus with an explicit demand for substantial financial assistance in exchange for his silence regarding these fraudulent schemes. Edward had apparently informed Marcus that he possessed documentation and witnesses to Marcus's criminal activities, and that he was prepared to provide this information to the appropriate authorities unless Marcus provided him with funds sufficient to resolve his substantial debts and financial difficulties. Marcus, confronted with the prospect of imprisonment and the permanent destruction of his remaining social standing, had apparently determined that eliminating Edward Ashford constituted a preferable alternative to submission to Edward's blackmail, and he had arranged to meet Edward at a remote location near the quarry on the evening of Edward's disappearance, under the pretense of negotiating the financial settlement. The confrontation that ensued had apparently proceeded with increasing violence, and Marcus, employing methods apparently derived from his criminal associations in London, had attacked Edward with a force and determination that had resulted in Edward's death. Marcus had then transported Edward's body to the quarry and had attempted to conceal it beneath debris and water in a manner he believed would delay or prevent discovery. The raincoat and other evidence at the scene had subsequently been transferred to the colonel's study by Marcus in a deliberate attempt to direct police suspicion toward his father, a strategy that had apparently functioned with considerable effectiveness until Miss Marple's observations and inquiries had prompted a re-examination of the evidence and the investigation's fundamental assumptions. Inspector Morton acknowledged that physical evidence, including fingerprints discovered at the scene and bloodstains found on certain articles of Marcus's clothing, had now been correlated with the investigation's new direction, and that this evidence substantial. Y supported the conclusion that Marcus, rather than Colonel Blackwood, bore responsibility for Edward Ashford's death. Furthermore, Inspector Morton revealed that Marcus's initial denials had gradually yielded under the weight of accumulated evidence, and that Marcus had ultimately provided a confession detailing the circumstances surrounding Edward's murder, though his account attempted to characterize the killing as an act of self-defense that had escalated beyond his initial intentions. Miss Marple received this confirmation of her theoretical reconstruction with the composed satisfaction of one whose analytical processes had been substantiated through proper investigative procedures, though she recognized that the confirmation brought with it certain complications regarding the broader implications for the Blackwood family and for the village community itself. Following Inspector Morton's departure, she remained contemplative regarding the psychological and social dimensions of the case that transcended the mere mechanics of criminal investigation. She reflected upon the manner in which desperation and criminal association had transformed Marcus Blackwood from a respectable businessman into a murderer, and upon the manner in which Edward Ashford's own criminality and blackmail threats had precipitated the circumstances leading to his death. She contemplated the position of Colonel Blackwood, whose innocence had been established, yet whose reputation and family relationships had sustained substantial damage through his initial arrest and the subsequent revelation of his son's guilt and his wife's emotional infidelity. She considered the situation of Margaret Blackwood, whose testimony had ultimately proved crucial to establishing Marcus's guilt, and whose willingness to betray family loyalty in service to truth had apparently destroyed her marriage irreparably. Within days, the more intensive aspects of the investigation concluded, and formal charges were filed against Marcus Blackwood for the murder of Edward Ashford. The proceedings that followed proceeded through the judicial system with the deliberate pace characteristic of English law, and the village gradually began the process of absorbing the full implications of what had transpired and of adjusting its social narratives to accommodate the revelations that had emerged. Colonel Blackwood, released from custody following the evidence establishing his innocence, returned to Thornfield House with a manner suggesting that his experience of investigation and accusation had altered something fundamental in his understanding of trust and family relationships. Margaret Blackwood, following a period of considerable domestic discord and social isolation, ultimately determined to pursue a legal separation from her husband, a development that scandalized the village in the manner such developments typically did, though the specific circumstances proved sufficiently complicated to restrain the most virulent gossip. Timothy Ashford, freed from the anxiety and fear that had characterized his comportment during the investigation, gradually resumed his ordinary life in the village, though the knowledge of his brother's criminality and the circumstances of Edward's death appeared to have introduced a permanent quality of sobriety into his previously lighter demeanor. The village, as villages do, began its process of assimilation and normalization, converting the extraordinary events that had transpired into narratives suitable for extended discussion and eventual integration into the village's collective memory. Miss Marple, observing these various developments with her characteristic attentiveness, recognized that the investigation and its conclusion had revealed not merely the mechanics of criminal action, but also the profound ways in which human desperation, family dynamics, and the concealed dimensions of apparently respectable lives could combine to produce tragedy and violence beneath the surface of ordinary suburban existence. The trial of Marcus Blackwood concluded on a grey November afternoon, some 4 months after the discovery of Edward Ashford's body in the quarry, and the verdict of guilty delivered by the jury appeared to generate in the courtroom a quality of finality that suggested the judicial system had fulfilled its obligation to establish truth and to impose consequence upon criminal action. Marcus received his sentence of life imprisonment with the composed demeanor of one who had apparently reconciled himself to the inevitable outcome of his actions, though observers noted in his expression a quality suggesting that the reality of his situation had acquired dimensions of permanence that his earlier confidence had not anticipated. Miss Marple attended the trial proceedings in person, seated in the public gallery with her customary dignified bearing, and her presence appeared to attract the attention of various parties involved in the proceedings, though she maintained throughout the proceedings an expression of such neutral attentiveness that it remained impossible to discern her private judgments regarding the events being adjudicated. Following the conclusion of the trial, she made her way back to St. Mary Mead through the autumn afternoon, walking with her characteristic deliberate pace, and she permitted herself to reflect upon the case with the measured consideration that characterized her approach to human behavior and criminal motivation. The village, upon her return, had begun its gradual transition into the rhythm of late autumn, with gardens being prepared for winter dormancy and the various social obligations and gathering. Ease that had characterized the spring and summer months yielding to the quieter social patterns of the colder seasons. The fate that had been interrupted by the morning's discoveries had never been successfully rescheduled, and the fundraising for the parish hall had instead proceeded through alternative mechanisms that possessed considerably less festive character, though the necessary funds had eventually been accumulated through subscriptions and private donations. The Blackwood residence, which had briefly served as the center of intense village speculation and police investigation, had gradually receded into a quieter existence, with Colonel Blackwood occupying the house in a manner suggesting resignation rather than the proprietorial confidence he had previously demonstrated. Margaret Blackwood had taken residence in a cottage on the opposite side of the village, establishing herself as a woman of independent means and somewhat progressive attitudes, and she had gradually become involved in various village activities and charitable enterprises that suggested she had determined to construct a life of considerable purposefulness beyond her former identity as the Colonel's wife. Timothy Ashford, his initial anxiety and fear resolved through the investigation's conclusion, had apparently developed an understanding with young Gwyneth regarding romantic intentions, and the village observed their gradual progression toward a formal understanding with the approving attention such developments typically generated in communities where young people's future happiness constituted a matter of collective concern and interest. It was in early December, as the village had settled into the particular quietness characteristic of the season preceding Christmas, that Miss Marple received a visitor whose arrival occasioned some surprise, for Dr. Havering called upon her at her cottage, bearing with him an expression, suggesting he wished to engage in conversation of some significance. Miss Marple received him in her sitting room, provided him with tea, and listened as he expressed his appreciation for her role in the investigation and her recognition of certain details that the police investigation had initially overlooked. Dr. Havering acknowledged that his earlier reluctance to disclose certain information had proceeded from his concern regarding professional confidentiality and his initial belief that the police investigation was proceeding appropriately, and he expressed his gratitude that Miss Marple's perceptiveness had ultimately established the truth regarding Marcus Blackwood's guilt and his father's innocence. More significantly, Dr. Havering ventured to express his admiration for Miss Marple's methodology and her particular genius for recognizing in human behavior patterns that suggested motive and opportunity that more conventional investigative approaches might overlook. He inquired, with evident genuine interest, whether Miss Marple possessed any formal training in investigative procedures or whether her remarkable perceptiveness proceeded from natural inclination and extensive observation of human nature over decades of village residence. Miss Marple, responding to this inquiry with her characteristic modesty, suggested that her particular skills derived entirely from her observation of village life and her recognition that human nature, regardless of the social status or apparent respectability of the individual, possessed certain consistencies and patterns that repeated themselves with remarkable regularity across different circumstances and social contexts. She elaborated upon her theory that understanding human motivation required not technical expertise, but rather careful attention to behavior, recognition of inconsistency, and the willingness to consider alternative explanations for apparently obvious conclusions. She noted that the police investigation, proceeding from the logical assumption that Colonel Blackwood possessed sufficient motive and opportunity to murder Edward Ashford, had neglected to consider adequately the possibility that alternative suspects might possess equally compelling motives and considerably less obvious means of concealing their actions. Following Dr. Havering's departure, Miss Marple returned to her customary occupations, and as the Christmas season progressed, the village settled into its traditional patterns of celebration and family gathering. She attended the Christmas service at the parish church, where she observed the various members of the community assembled in their customary locations, and she permitted herself to reflect upon the ways in which the events of the preceding months had altered certain relationships and understandings within the village while leaving other fundamental patterns seemingly undisturbed. She observed Colonel Blackwood seated in his traditional pew, his bearing slightly more subdued than it had been previously, and she noted that Margaret Blackwood attended the service seated with her friends rather than with her husband, a physical separation that seemed to reflect the emotional and legal separation that had now become formalized through the legal proceedings. She observed Timothy and Gwyneth seated together with what appeared to be an understanding regarding their future intentions, and she recognized in their youthful hopefulness the continuity of life and community that transcended the particular tragedies and complications that had temporarily disrupted the village's routine. As Christmas evening descended and Miss Marple sat alone in her cottage with the fire providing warmth and comfort against the winter cold, she, Aloe, wed herself to reflect upon the case with a particular satisfaction that accompanied the successful resolution of complex human mysteries. She recognized that the events of the preceding months had revealed certain truths regarding human nature, that desperation and fear could motivate apparently respectable individuals to actions of considerable violence, that criminal association and moral compromise could transform character gradually rather than through sudden dramatic change, and that the apparently peaceful exterior of village life frequently concealed emotional turbulence and moral complexity of considerable depth. She recognized further that the investigation had demonstrated certain truths regarding the nature of justice itself, that apparent guilt could mask innocent suffering, that truth required careful investigation and willingness to challenge initial assumptions, and that the pursuit of justice demanded not merely adherence to procedure, but genuine commitment to understanding the reality beneath surface appearances. As the new year approached, Miss Marple returned to her customary occupations of gardening and needlework, her mind already engaging in the subtle observation of village life that constituted her primary occupation and source of endless fascination. The case of Edward Ashford's death and Marcus Blackwood's guilt gradually assumed its place in the accumulating collection of human observations and behavioral patterns that informed her particular genius for understanding the hidden dimensions of apparently ordinary village existence.